of Money with Santosh Sirur.
Hello and welcome to another episode of The Sound of Money. And today we continue our conversations with Madan Sabnavis, who is the chief economist with CARE Ratings. And as we know, he's written 4 books, and one of the books being Hits and Misses, the Indian banking story. So in the context of the recent, the budget, of course, the economic policy that was announced very recently, the monetary policy that was announced by the RBI. Let's talk to Madan and know a little more about what lies ahead for India in the coming years. So Madan, welcome back on The Sound of Money.
Thank you.
Yeah. So Madan, such a fantastic fortnight. We had the economic survey to begin with. Then we had the budget, the big blaster budget, as they call it. And as the finance minister rightly put it, never ever been in the last 100 years kind of a document. And then you had the RBI announcing the monetary policy. If you tie the threads, where do you see this going?
Yeah, actually, Santosh, I would have a slightly moderated view about what you have said, because if you really look at the budgetary numbers closely, you'll realize that the overall size of the budget was almost similar to what it was last year, the revised numbers. So it's not really a kind of a big blast or kind of a big fiscal stimulus which has been provided. But definitely in terms of conservatism, the government is not following it, because they're not looking at a fiscal path towards 3%. They're talking of 4.5% fiscal deficit in the next 4 years. That is, we're talking of up to 25, 26. So to that extent, there is a stimulus which is being provided. That's a strong message which is being sent, because we always felt that the government was going to be conservative when it came to spending. That's not going to happen. But within it, it's still been a very, very prudent budget. So nothing really wrong in the budget. They've managed the numbers fairly well in terms of channeling them into capital expenditure, into health, into well-being, without really imposing any serious taxes on the public. So therefore, it's obviously a very good budget. What we as economists call it a Pareto optimal situation, where nobody's worse off and someone is better off.
Yeah.
But if you're thinking that this is going to drive the economy forward, I don't think so. Because finally, the economic growth comes from the private sector. The private sector needs to invest more. People like you and me need to find more jobs. We need to have our incomes increasing. So consumption has to increase. So consumption and investment have been the lacuna in the Indian economy in the last 3 years, even before the pandemic struck. Until that gets reversed, I think the government can supplement, but it cannot be driving the economy.
But then why has it then been, there is terrific euphoria post the budget, the stock markets again going rooftops. You don't find a genuine, strong criticism, frankly. So why is that so?
No, because see, the thing is that everybody goes by the headline numbers. You look at the 34.8 lakh crores size of the budget. You look at the fiscal deficit being 6.8%. There have been very strong messages sent in terms of privatization of public sector enterprises. I think that's something which has really caught the attention of the people in the private sector. And I think that's why the markets have been going fairly crazy. Because I don't think anybody believes that a government with a 34 lakh crore budget, of which your capital expenditure, say 5.5 lakh crores, can really drive an economy which is supposed to be around 225 lakh crores. It's 5.5 divided by 225 lakh crores, around 2.5%. So I don't think the government can do it, and never in India's history has the government been the primary factor. It has to come from the private sector. And I think the private sector has been always passing the buck, saying the government should spend on infrastructure, but the government is doing its job this time. They've done it in 2021. They're going to do it in 21-22. But that's only a kind of a nudge which is being provided. Finally, it will have to come from the private sector.
Yeah. So when you say it's private sector, the disinvestment route, be it, the two public sector banks or the GIC, one of the LIC, of course, and there's talk of one GIC company and Air India, of course. So do you see this? Are we on the right trajectory? Is that happening eventually?
See, actually, eventually one hopes it happens. I think there's a lot of determination which has been put forward by the government. But the history, the track record of disinvestment has not been very good in the Indian economy. Even last year, they spoke of something like 2.1 lakh crores, nowhere near the number. I think it's going to be some 20, 30, 40,000 crores. Yeah. So I think that confidence as to why should we be able to raise 1.75 lakh crores this year there's always a question mark. But I think confidence comes from the fact that there have been messages sent by different officials in the Ministry of Finance that the plans are afoot. They already know what's going to happen in Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4. So therefore, there is a possibility that this number would be more real this year. But I would still keep my fingers crossed. And I think until we are able to achieve this, only then will we feel convinced that it's actually possible to do it. Because we should remember there should be the absorptive capacity of the market. Can the market really absorb 1.75 lakh crores of government paper? And they're going to be different kinds of companies. Just imagine you have an LIC, maybe some public sector banks, BPCL, Air India. Everything has its own strengths, negatives which are there. So it'll be very interesting to see if this thing really works out. But if it does work out, I think it actually sets the tone, because the government has been harping on the concept called privatization rather than disinvestment, saying they want to change the basic ethic of saying that we don't want to control enterprises. Let the enterprises go ahead and work the way they want to. Let them be privatized. Let the entire culture change. I think that's what the government is aiming for.
Absolutely. So it didn't appear to be a consumption-oriented budget, as in the taxes structures were as is. There were no changes. A little bit of administrative taxation, a bit of changes out there. So even that is equally important. I mean, and where I come from is even from a job standpoint. So where do you see this budget talking about these two key areas?
No, actually, Santosh, you've hit the nail on the head, because there's been nothing there for consumption. In fact, while nobody is worse off, as I said, but the thing is, we are not better off on this particular count on both consumption as well as investment, because there's been no incentive given for the individuals to spend more. I don't see anything which is going to create more jobs, except from the fact that in case the government spends 5.5 lakh crores on capex, it will lead to certain project creation, which will lead to demand for certain goods. And those industries will, of course, hire more people, hopefully. But otherwise, there's no push given to consumption at all. So, and there's been no tax cut. In fact, at certain levels, I think for people who are supposedly are rich, in the sense that you have the EPF clause, which has come in, that if you're contributing more than 2.5 lakh rupees on an annual basis, you're going to be taxed. Your interest on EPF is going to be taxed. That's probably not a good thing for some of us. But otherwise, there's been no incentive as such which has been provided for consumption. Similarly, if you look at investment, corporates were also hoping that something would be given to make sure that the investment cycle begins. But I don't think there's been anything provided out there. So it's been fairly silent on consumption, investment, which also means that the ability of the budget to create jobs is very much limited. We're back to square one, saying that we have to wait for a good harvest. We need to have people like you and I spend more money, which will lead to higher demand. Higher demand means higher capacity utilization, which leads to higher investment. Simultaneously, more jobs are created and incomes are generated, and then the spending is reinforced. So this kind of a chain we have been looking at, hoping that it would work the last couple of years. It hasn't really worked out. And while one can say there's reason for one to be optimistic, but again, I would keep my fingers crossed about whether this really happens this year. So even though, see, if you look at the Reserve Bank, you look at the Ministry of Finance, all of us are looking at a double-digit growth coming in 21-22. It's going to be more of a statistical nature. I don't think this is going to be commensurate with the kind of jobs, because I think most companies are still trying to get back on their feet. There's a lot of reliance being paid on technology to replace labor. So I think everybody's trying to cut down on labor costs. Labor costs and office space, I think two things which I think this pandemic has led to, which is going to actually may not be good news from the point of view of overall consumption.
Yeah. The other thing I wanted to talk to you was on the banking space. And again, coming back to your book, where you did talk about privatization of bank, and that's a bit of talk about in this budget, two public sector banks being likely looked into as privatization. In fact, all the public sector bank shares went up because no one knew which bank was in the fray for this. So where do you see this happening, given the challenges of the public sector bank?
No, I think, Santosh, the problem here with privatization of public sector banks, it's not an easy concept. Okay, because if you're looking at public sector banks, it's something which are very an integral part of the overall political economy of the country.
Yeah,
I think that's where the problem lies, because if we see a large number of programs of the government, I'm not just talking of this present government, even the past governments, are being done through the public sector banking system. So I need the public sector banks to do Jandan. I need the public sector banks to do SME lending, Mudra loans. So I think this is a hard reality. So can we actually think of a situation where the government will say that I've identified bank A and B, and I'm going to go below 50%, I'll hold on to 49%. I seriously doubt if such a call can be taken. That will be a very bold decision to take. It could have been taken earlier. In fact, it was felt that when we had this banking bureau board, which was supposed to appoint various personnel or the senior level management of public sector banks, It was felt that would make a difference. But we had this crazy situation where members of the BBB were appointed by the government. So the government appointed members of the BBB, which were appointing members of the chairman, MDs of various banks. So it didn't actually change the way in which business was done. So I think this is going to be a very critical factor as to whether the government is willing to go down to 49%, and they should do it fast. If you're going to do it, maybe I do 10% from bank A, 20% I divest to bank B. I think that will help you to get the money, but it will not be help to change the overall culture of the way in which banking is done. And I think it's the same ideological problem which is there, that if you're talking of insurance companies, I always believe, Santosh, that insurance companies, state-owned insurance companies, are the investor of last resort. Mm-hmm. Every time I have a disinvestment program and I don't have anybody to buy it, I give it over to the insurance companies because that's a safe way of transferring assets from one public sector to another public sector unit, and the government gets into revenue. So are we actually willing to say that at some point of time, the government's stake in the insurance companies is going to go down to 49%, and I won't be able to have this kind of investor sort of concept. Absolutely. So all this, I think, it's not something which I should look at in a one-year horizon. I think this is something which probably, hopefully in the next 5 to 10 years, we'll get a clearer idea about whether there is this intention to go below 49% or 50%.
Yeah. So do you think this is a roadmap from the government, with key milestones in the coming years, and we move towards the vision that they're looking at?
No, again, Santosh, I think this could be the first step. Because very often, governments start off with something, they're very enthusiastic in the first year. You say, okay, this year I'm going to divest 10% or 15% in a particular organization, but then there is no follow-up action which is taken. So even today, if you look at quite a few public sector banks, the government stake is not 100%. It's probably in a region of around 60 to 80%. Means there was some intention at some point of time to disinvest, but it was only up to a certain extent to get hold of the money to finance your budget. But there was never this thing of saying that, look, I want to go down below 50%. It's not happened for any of these banks.
Absolutely. Yeah. There's another area that was touched on the budget is about the bond market, where there is direct retail investment, or there's a plan at least to have the retail investors directly come in. So bond with the government, is that going to happen, or how difficult is it? And the challenge is ahead.
No, actually, again, Santosh, it sounds very nice, but I think the government securities market, one has to understand a couple of things. One is that while we keep saying it's a liquid market, but actually the secondary market exists only for maybe a handful of 5 or 7 securities. Mm-hmm. Okay, and these are also the benchmark securities of 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. And the problem is that the benchmark ceases to be a benchmark once the 10-year tenure goes off. So today I buy the 5.77% bond of 2030, and once a new bond becomes the benchmark, automatically this becomes a 9-year security and it's out of the market. So as a retail investor, if I go in for a bank deposit, I know that if I want a premature encashment, I can do it. Whereas for a government bond, I will not be able to do it. I think that's what people should realize. The second part is, if we look at the government itself, you're offering a return of, say, maybe 6% on a 10-year bond.
Yeah.
But you also have the government bond, which the RBI is managing. It's called the floating rate bond, where you get a return of 6.80 plus 35 basis points, 7.15 basis points. So you automatically have certain government schemes under the small savings, your NSCs, your Kisan Vikas Patra, which are giving higher returns for a shorter tenure.
Yeah.
So I think there is a lot of competition going on between these instruments itself. And I think there's no reason why I, as an investor, should go in for a government security, which is hard to comprehend, difficult to sell. I'd rather go in for some alternative instrument provided by the government itself, which is giving me a higher return. In fact, the only way it will work is in case we have the concept of tax-free bonds. I think that will appeal a lot to retail investors. Give me a return of 6.5% for 10 years, but you say I don't have to pay any tax on it. I think that will work a lot in the market. It should be a simple instrument, something which we all understand. I buy a 10-year bond, 7-year bond, whatever it is. And if at all it can be listed, it gets listed, but just like what happens with the tax-free bonds. And I know what kind of a payoff is there for that. I get a certain return, I hold for a certain maturity. And if I want to sell it in the market, I'm able to sell it in the market. I think that's what's going to work. Yeah. GSEC market, I think government securities as such are fairly complex. They're not easy for us to understand. And I think that's the reason why we go through the gilt funds of the mutual funds. Yeah. I think a gilt mutual fund is the right way to have access to government securities, where you don't take take on this additional responsibility of understanding what you're doing.
Absolutely. So it needs to be very operationally seamless. I think that's the key when they really roll out. Absolutely. So one last question before we wrap up this episode, Madan. I did read somewhere in one of your articles that this budget in some ways was Keynesian in spirit. And was a little growth oriented. What, if at all, is the silver lining that you see in this budget?
See, the only silver lining I see in terms of growth is the fact that there is a bit of capital expenditure taking place. It is slightly higher than what it was. It was around 4.3 lakh crores last year. Now they're making it 5.5 lakh crores. So definitely there's some kind of a push which is being given in terms of higher spending. And more importantly, ideologically, the fact that FM has said that we have a fiscal deficit of 6.8%. We are not in a hurry to go to the level of 4.5%. And even the 4.5% norm is better than the 3% norm in terms of an emerging market like ours. It's a feeling that there is a kind of a Keynesian push which has been given to say that the government is going to prod along to make sure that to the extent it's possible, the government will do its part in terms of spending. Of course, I go back to saying that the final thing has to come from the private sector. The government on its own will not be able to do it. In fact, the state governments also have to chip in. They've also been given some more leeway in terms of having higher fiscal deficits. I think that will also contribute because typically states spend more on capital expenditure than the center does. So I think all this put together will work. But again, finally, it has to be the private sector, private sector, private sector.
Absolutely. And in fact, that comes up even where the Prime Minister Modi's statement very recently in the parliament, where he says wealth creators, the focus has to be on wealth creators. He really directly hits out at the role of the private sector, and hope we get onto that route and see India in a better shape in coming years.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Madan. As always, it's been amazing talking to you. And please do join us on our series of The Sound of Money with me, Santosh Sirur. And thanks, Madan, for joining us on this episode of The Sound of Money.
Sound of Money with Santosh Sirur.